Hello, hello. It's a nice day today. A few clouds sprinkled about, but the sun is quite present today. The birds are decorating our sound waves. Today, for discussion, it's Zanoni by Edward Bulwer Lytton. Take a look. Now, Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton is not a writer that is discussed too much anymore. I can't exactly remember how I came to start to read this book and want to read this book. I think it was because there was a time where I was quite interested in the esoteric and the occult, and this book came up. But he's not a particularly popular writer nowadays. However, there are still a handful and a good following that he still has. But I think it is largely because of that esoteric and occult aspect of him. Now, before I get too much into him or this book, we're going to discuss a little bit about him. He was a nobleman, an Englishman. He was a writer and a politician during the Victorian era. So that would be around the mid-19th century. He was contemporary with Charles Dickens, and they actually knew each other quite well. And Charles Dickens actually borrowed quite a lot of ideas from Edward Bulwer Lytton. His style can be described as quite Gothic often. He wrote quite prolifically, and he was quite a prominent politician. He was, as mentioned, a member of Parliament. He was a Whig. The Whig Party was a political movement in England and the United States. They're not a movement as much anymore, but they favored, for the most part, free trade, a bit more liberties to the individual, as well as the curbing of monarchical power. Now, his style is quite luxurious in writing, at least from Zanoni that I got. It often turns quite luxurious, a lot of embellishments. But as a writer, he was quite prolific, and he wrote in different genres. Some of his writing is quite decadent, very Victorian decadent. It can almost be compared to Charles Dickens, although Dickens to me is a much better writer and much more uniform in style, which I enjoy about Dickens. Edward Bulwer Lytton is a little bit sometimes all over the place. At least that's what I got from Zanoni. His stuff can also creep into horror, supernatural. There's a lot of those elements from what I hear in his other books, as well as science fiction. His later stuff is quite influential in the science fiction genres. He was very influential as a writer to the esoteric traditions. And there are some, and Zanoni is the book perhaps that most marks him as being an influential writer to later developments of occult and theosophy. I'm not sure how that's pronounced. Theosophy, I think. So essentially a merger of older occult traditions, a bit of Christianity, Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, Eastern traditions, and all of that. There was a point in my life where I was quite interested in that. I'm partially a bit interested in that now. Perhaps not as much as I was before, but it's still always an interesting thing, I think. Understanding about the esoterica, the occult, different ways of seeing the world, the idea that perhaps there is a lost ancient form of knowledge that we are losing. These are all themes that a lot of people quite gravitate towards, and I would say that I do as well. Now, Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton was also a Rosicrucian, which is we like to say it's 16th century, I think. It's a 16th century order. Continued on, and I think it might even be continuing on today, I'm sure. Rosicrucian. It's like the Rose Cross order. It began in Germany, and it's one of those secret societies. There's a big emphasis on alchemy. I think a bit of Gnosticism as well, as far as the Rosicrucians. Now, Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton. It's unfortunate that even with his prolific writings, nowadays he's perhaps remembered most for the Bulwer Lytton contest, which is an annual contest that was begun in the 1980s. It's a joke of a contest in which contestants have to write the most grotesque opening sentences to a novel. And this is because Sir Edward Bulwer Lytton began a novel with "It was a dark and stormy night." Dun dun dun! How dare he? How dare he do that? What a horrible writer. How dare he? No, I'm joking. "It was a dark and stormy night" is perhaps, let's be honest, that's not the worst way to start a novel. It's a bit trite, it's a bit cliche nowadays especially, but it really was not the worst way to start a novel in the 19th century. I'm sure there were way worse ways, but that is what he's remembered for, and that contest continues on to this day. All right, that's enough about our noble friend Bulwer Lytton. Now we're discussing Zanoni. Now, Zanoni was written in 1842. It's a pretty big book. There are 7 parts to it, 7 sections. And initially, it concerns a love triangle, it seems. So it's part love triangle, part historical fiction, and part philosophy and like esoterica, I would say. Those are the 3 parts, with the historical fiction being probably the least. So it's really just philosophy and a love triangle a bit. But even the love triangle angle, the romance, I should actually correct myself. It's not as much a love triangle in the sense that it's a romance. Initially, it does feel like a love triangle, but that gets resolved quite. That tension doesn't, I think, last throughout the novel. The love triangle gets resolved quite before the halfway point, I would say, of the novel. And the love triangle concerns the 3 characters of Zanoni, Viola, and Glyndon. Now, Zanoni is the titular character. He is a charming, esoteric man, and he holds keys to immortality. He has a higher consciousness. He's kind of like think of like a vampire, but not that evil. He's kind of a good person. He has compassion for humans, or at least that's what he's definitely developing. And Viola, who is a singer, an opera singer, whose voice is so beautiful, and she seems to essentially embody music. She embodies music herself, the ideal of beauty in music and music. And Glyndon, who is a painter, very much an aspiring painter as well, who who takes fancy to Viola quite early on, but he can't seem to commit to her. And he gets put on the path, Zanoni's path, of essentially trying to attain a higher level of consciousness, a type of nirvana. He wants some of the secrets that Zanoni has. In addition to that, there are a few other characters, quite a few villains that are put in there. The villains are pretty one-dimensional. They're kind of always baddies, and they always do bad things and say bad things. There's also Mehinor. I'm going to pronounce it Mehinor, who is also part of this ancient order with Zanoni. I think we can say the order is of a Rosicrucian nature. and he's part of this ancient order. He's older than Zanoni though, and as opposed to Zanoni, who in life takes a liking to music and art and the ideal and has compassion for the human race, Mehenor is more of a contemplative and science-based. He's a bit of like the kind of professor type, the scholar type, as opposed to Zanoni, who is much more becoming drawn to emotions, essentially. In fact, Zanoni is described as one of those fools of feeling. He describes himself as that at one point. And that's because when he has this higher consciousness, which he's developed throughout his life, and he's essentially immortal. They have found the elixir of life, and they know how to live forever. When he starts to develop compassion for humans, it also stunts his magical powers in many ways. And I'm reminded of there are quite a few stories like that, where the angel or the demon falls in love with a human, and they suffer for that. So there's also the historical element, which is alluded to at the start, but you really are presented with it at the last part of the novel, which is that this is the end of the 18th century. This was written in the middle of the 19th century, but the setting is the end of the 18th century, and it's really throughout Europe. You follow these characters throughout Europe, but the Age of Revolution, especially in France, is the setting for the last part, and this is Robespierre's France. Now, Robespierre was a big figure in the French Revolution, a figure who there was a lot of promise to him. He was definitely a very intellectual figure, smart figure, but even for him, the revolution got out of hand in France, and he suffered for that. There's the dichotomy between this idea of reason and rationality of the Enlightenment, and Bulwer Lytton seems to imply that this. Bulwer Lytton expresses, I believe, a negative, or at least a muted skepticism, a sense of skepticism towards this age of reason and rationality that came with the Enlightenment, and that kind of stoked these revolutionary ideas in France. He saw that as often he seems to see that as a bit of a farce, a bit of a fraud, in which people are just trying to attain power, and people haven't really attained this nirvana, or this higher consciousness. And of course, he thinks that he has a bit of the secrets, being a part of the Rosicrucians and all of that. Art is looked as a bridge to the divine. Our art is looked as something that can take us closer to the divine. Fear is looked up as an enemy of knowledge. This is a common theme. Fear is the mind killer. That's that Dune quote. And when the soul is elevated to the sublime, it surpasses systems of the world. That might be a quote in the novel. And that's essentially Zanoni, that there are different systems in this world. There are different, perhaps we can describe them as levels of consciousness. And when your soul is elevated from that, when your soul starts to understand different aspects of the world, how different things are connected, and starts to focus on different things being connected, you start to surpass those other systems. That's something to chew on, definitely. A few quotes. This novel is quite ripe with nice and interesting esoteric quotes. They're not too esoteric though, but they're just they're quite palatable, but very, very easy to but very worthwhile to ponder on. Fear is the attraction of man to the theist earth, and while he fears, he cannot soar. Fear is the attraction of man to the theist earth, and while he fears, he cannot soar. Out of his soul, here's another quote, out of his soul he created the life and the world for which his soul was fitted. So a sense of, I guess we could say, manifesting or creating the realities and the systems that your soul is most attuned and fitted towards. There's a lot of discussion around art in this novel. Every true critic, so this is a paraphrased quote, I believe. Every true critic in art has sought to instruct that nature is not to be copied but exalted. That nature is not to be copied but exalted. And of art, do not profane that. So there's a lot of discussion of art. And there's one in which he's discussing, Zanoni is talking to Glyden. And he says, of art, do not so profane that glorious word. What nature is to God, art should be to man. A sublime, beneficent, and genial, and warm creation. So quite a lot of discussion on art. I found that this novel was quite fruitful in many ways. However, it's very inconsistent. Bulwer Lytton changes between styles of writing, which can seem a bit refreshing, but to me it's quite jarring. The locations also change when they follow different characters in quite a jarring shift. Some of the writing is quite simple, especially when he describes certain conversations with we can describe them as base characters, like the villains, and I found them to be very one-dimensional. And any scene in which there was a discussion with a villain or something like that, it seemed almost cartoonish. So whenever the plot seemed to move forward, there was a very simple. It moved forward in a very simple way, I found. However, when there were discussions with these esoteric characters, then it became much more heavy. And he kind of cycles between that quite a lot. And I found that was a little bit jarring. And because of that, it might lead to a reading. I feel like as a reader, you might miss certain things if you're not paying attention. If you don't, if you're in the mode that, okay, this is a quick read, this is happening here, the plot is progressing, and then it gets to a very, very philosophical passage. You really have to attune the way you're reading. I also felt like it was a bit repetitive as far as the philosophy, often at times, but still quite worthwhile to read. Quite influential in the esoteric tradition, as I mentioned. There is an entity that appears here called the Dweller of the Threshold, or the Dweller on the Threshold, and this is an entity that sort of causes a roadblock. It imposes itself on those who are trying to seek a spiritual development and attainment. This Dweller of the Threshold is sort of someone that confronts, an entity that confronts the knowledge seeker, and how you pass, whether or not you pass through this test, can very much determine aspects of your life, how you are going to progress in life, whether you are going to attain this, whether you are going to reach this spiritual attainment, or whether you might be cursed and haunted by this failure. Now, it seems like Bulwer Lytton introduced this concept or this figure. Maybe took it from somewhere else, but he definitely introduced it in writing in a certain way, and this Dweller on the Threshold appears in later esoteric and occult writings. He also influenced Charles Dickens quite a lot. The ending to this novel was very much Charles Dickens actually read this novel and was influenced by the ending so much that it influenced his A Tale of Two Cities. I'm not going to spoil too much. I'm not really going to spoil that ending, because this is quite a long book. It's about 550 pages, but it's worth reading, I think, if you're interested in an esoteric and philosophical book. Do be warned, though, it can feel a little bit uneven. Some of the writing is quite ornate, a little bit decadent, and if you don't like that too much, this might feel like a slog to you. But overall, quite an interesting book, worth checking out. Take care.